Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
I never imagined I'd stride into a courtroom feeling like the executioner rather than the victim, but there I was, heels echoing on the polished floors of the Cook County Courthouse, briefcase in hand, ready to watch my parents' world crumble under the weight of their own greed. It was one of those muggy Chicago afternoons where the air sticks to your skin like regret, and as I caught my mother's eye roll from across the room, that same dismissive flick she'd given me since I was a kid, I almost pitied them. Almost. They had no idea the quiet girl they'd ignored for decades had become a force, armed with secrets that could bury them deeper than any inheritance dispute. But let's back up, because this mess didn't start with gavels and judgments. It began with a childhood of silence and a grandfather who taught me that family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the one person who shows up when no one else does. My name is Emily Harper, and growing up in the flatlands outside Chicago, I was the invisible daughter of Richard and Linda Harper, two folks who chased the suburban dream with all the fervor of folks betting their last dime on a lottery ticket. Dad sold life insurance policies door to door, always one sale away from that big break that would buy them the McMansion and the shiny SUV, while Mom managed a little dress shop in the strip mall, hawking clearance racks and gossip to bored housewives. They weren't monsters, not in the screaming, belt-whipping sense you see in those intervention shows, but their neglect was a slow poison, the kind that seeps in until you question if you're even worth noticing. Family dinners were solo affairs with TV dinners cooling on a tray, school plays attended by empty seats because something came up at work, and holidays that felt like obligations checked off a list. I remember my 10th birthday, Mom handed me a wrapped gift from the dollar store, a puzzle with half the pieces missing, and said, "There, that's something to keep you busy." It was their way, I guess, of loving from a distance, but that distance grew into a chasm wider than the Chicago River after a storm. Then Grandpa Victor Langford entered the picture like a lifeline tossed into rough waters. He was Mom's dad, a rough-around-the-edges millionaire who'd clawed his way up from nothing, starting with a single hardware store in the Depression era and turning it into a chain that dotted the Midwest like reliable old friends. Grandpa saw the cracks in my parents' facade right away, their endless excuses, the way they prioritized easy money over everything else, and when I was 8, after they'd forgotten to pick me up from school for the third time that month, he made his move. I can still hear his voice on the phone, gravelly and unyielding. "Emily's coming to stay with me, Linda. You two figure out the details, but it's happening." Mom put up a half-hearted fight, whining about how it would look to the neighbors, but Grandpa wired them enough cash to hush the complaints, and just like that, I was packed off to his big house on the edge of the city, a place with creaky oak floors, a workshop full of tools that smelled like sawdust and possibility, and a grandfather who looked at me like I was the most important project he'd ever tackled. Living with Grandpa was like stepping into a different America, the kind of self-made story that gets told around backyard barbecues by folks who believe in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. He put me in a solid school district, spent evenings teaching me the business side of things, how to read a balance sheet, spot a bad deal from a mile away, and negotiate with suppliers who thought they had the upper hand. We'd sit on the back porch after dinner, him nursing a root beer and me listening to tales of his youth, outsmarting bootleggers during Prohibition, rebuilding after floods that wiped out his first store, and always warning me about people who'd smile while plotting your downfall. "Trust is earned, Emily, not given," he'd say, his eyes sharp under those bushy brows, and he lived it, treating me not like a kid, but like a partner in his empire. My parents? They faded to the background, sending the occasional postcard or calling when they needed a favor, like the time Dad asked for help with a car payment, acting like the years hadn't passed. I visited them now and then, out of some stubborn sense of what family should be, but it always ended in tension. Mom's snide comments about how Grandpa was turning me into a snob, Dad's awkward pats on the back that felt forced. It hurt, sure, but Grandpa's presence patched the wounds, showing me what real support looked like. He passed 2 years back, on a snowy January morning, slipping away peacefully in his sleep after a battle with heart trouble that he fought like every other challenge, head on, no complaints. The will was straightforward, everything to me. The houses, the stores pulling in 7 figures a year, the investments he'd squirreled away like a prudent squirrel before winter. No caveats, just a handwritten note slipped into the envelope. "You've got the grit, kid. Use it well." I was 40 then, already managing a chunk of his operations with a steady hand, but the inheritance hit like a thunderclap, reshaping my world into something secure and sprawling. Colleagues slapped me on the back, the community whispered about the lucky granddaughter, and for the first time, I felt untethered from the past, free to build on Grandpa's foundation without looking over my shoulder. That freedom didn't last. The overtures started subtle. An email from Mom about catching up and how family should stick together now more than ever. Then Dad called, his voice oily with false warmth, hinting at sharing the load of the estate. I brushed them off, figuring it was their pattern, but when the lawsuit papers arrived via courier, thick stack accusing me of undue influence, claiming Grandpa was of unsound mind when he wrote the will, the gloves came off. They wanted it all, or at least enough to bail out their sinking ship of debts and dreams deferred, blind to the fact that I'd spent years safeguarding his legacy against opportunists just like them. Sitting in my office that night, city lights twinkling like distant stars, I felt a mix of fury and dark amusement at the irony. After pretending I was a ghost, now they wanted to haunt me for millions. But as I pored over the complaint, a single line jumped out, a reference to some overlooked family contributions that didn't ring true. Little did they know, I had my own investigators on speed dial, and the real story behind Grandpa's fortune was about to surface, dragging secrets they'd buried deep into the light. The court date was set, and with it, the start of their reckoning. But first, one nagging question kept me up. What if their greed hid something even uglier? The lawsuit papers sat on my desk like a ticking bomb for days after they arrived, their crisp edges mocking me with legalese that twisted Grandpa's clear intentions into some convoluted conspiracy. And I couldn't shake the nagging sense that my parents' sudden boldness stemmed from more than just desperation. It felt calculated, like they'd been waiting for this moment to claw back what they saw as rightfully theirs, oblivious to the fortress I'd built around his legacy in the years since his death. I finally mustered the nerve to call Sarah Klein, the estate attorney who'd guided me through the will's aftermath with the precision of a surgeon, and we met at her firm downtown the next morning, the loop's hustle buzzing outside windows fogged by early fall chill, where she laid out the complaint with a no-nonsense dissection that revealed its flimsiness, claims of my manipulative influence over Grandpa during his illness, assertions that he'd promised them a share in hushed conversations I'd supposedly orchestrated to exclude them, all backed by nothing but their word and a few cherry-picked emails from years back that ignored the context of their repeated loan defaults. Sarah, with her sharp bob haircut and glasses that magnified her skeptical gaze, warned me that family disputes like this often devolve into emotional minefields, dragging out for months and costing more in therapy than legal fees, but I pressed on, insisting we counter hard because letting them think they could bully their way into millions would only invite more trouble down the line, especially since I'd glimpsed that odd reference to overlooked family contributions, which hinted at fabricated debts they might use to sway a sympathetic judge. We spent the afternoon strategizing, her outlining motions to dismiss, while I shared my gut feeling that their financial house of cards was teetering, built on the same shaky foundations that had prompted Grandpa to cut them off originally. And by the time we wrapped up, I felt a spark of that old resolve he'd instilled in me, the kind that turns underdogs into victors without breaking a sweat or compromising principles. Emboldened, I dove into Grandpa's archived files that evening in the quiet of my home office, the leather-bound ledgers and digital backups painting a vivid picture of my parents' long history of grasping at his generosity, like drowning swimmers clutching driftwood. Starting with a $20,000 bailout in the early 90s for Dad's failed attempt at a real estate flip that left them underwater on mortgages and owing suppliers across 3 counties. One document in particular stood out, a faded loan agreement from 15 years ago where they'd borrowed against the family name for Mom's boutique expansion, promising repayments that never came and instead spiraling into what looked like creative accounting. Inflated invoices to mask personal withdrawals, the sort of sleight of hand that might fly under IRS radar for small-timers, but screamed fraud when tied to a millionaire's estate. It was the first real clue, a thread pulling at the edges of their narrative, and as I cross-referenced it with public records on my laptop, the pieces clicked into a pattern of chronic opportunism that explained their neglect of me as much as their current lawsuit, prioritizing quick cash over parenting. Always one scheme away from stability, but never quite getting there. The demands escalated soon after, with Mom phoning my cell late one night, her voice a blend of saccharine pleading and underlying steel as she recounted tales of their sacrifices for my sake, conveniently omitting the boarding school years and the sporadic child support Grandpa had funneled their way to keep things civil. "Emily, honey, we're family. You can't just erase us like that," she cooed, but I cut her off gently, suggesting they consult their lawyer instead of me, which only fueled Dad's follow-up email the next day, a rambling missive full of accusations about my ingratitude and veiled threats of dragging our dirty laundry into court for all of Chicago to see. It was laughable in its audacity, the way they positioned themselves as the wronged parties after decades of radio silence, and that dark humor bubbled up in me as I imagined them pacing their modest ranch-style home in the suburbs, clipping coupons while plotting to append my life over a fortune they'd never earned. A dime toward building. That's when I decided on the mini revenge, a subtle jab that would sting without crossing into outright malice, reaching out anonymously to a journalist contact from my days handling Grandpa's media relations, feeding her just enough about the Harpers' entrepreneurial missteps, the boutique's history of bounce checks and supplier disputes, framed as a timely cautionary tale for middle-class families navigating economic squeezes in the post-pandemic world. The piece ran in the local business section a few days later, local couples' retail venture sours, lessons in financial overreach, with no names attached to the lawsuit but enough details to make my parents sweat. Their faces likely paling over breakfast as neighbors whispered and old clients called demanding explanations. It felt cleverly satisfying, like slipping sand into their shoes during a marathon, a reminder that their actions had consequences without me ever showing my hand, yet it left a twinge of unease. Was this the start of a cycle where I'd become as petty as they were, or just the justice Grandpa would have nodded approvingly at from beyond? As the pretrial motions filed and the court date locked in for 6 weeks out, the uncertainty deepened with that first anonymous call coming through on a blocked line just after midnight, a gravelly voice murmuring, "Emily, Victor kept files on your folks you haven't seen yet, ones that could end this before it starts, but they're dangerous," before the connection cut out, leaving me gripping the phone in the dim light of my bedroom, pulse racing as I wondered who this guardian shadow was and what buried truths about my family's tangled finances might surface next to tip the scales in ways even I couldn't predict. That anonymous call replayed in my head like a broken record during the rainy days that followed, each muffled word about Grandpa's hidden files stirring a cocktail of curiosity and dread that made sleep elusive and every shadow in my condo seem like a lurking informant, pushing me to accelerate the probe into my parents' murky past before their lawsuit gained any more traction in the courts. I looped in Tom Riley, the private investigator Grandpa had trusted for business cleanups, meeting him at a nondescript coffee shop on the north side where the aroma of fresh brews masked the tension of our conversation, and laid out the voice details along with the loan discrepancies I'd uncovered, watching his weathered face crease with that familiar mix of intrigue and caution as he promised to dig without stirring the hornet's nest too soon. Tom was old school, the type of guy who'd navigated Chicago's underbelly since the 70s, trading in whispers and public records rather than flashy gadgets, and he assured me that if Victor had squirreled away dirt on the Harpers, it would surface like silt after a flood, but to brace for revelations that might blur the lines between victim and villain in our family saga. We started with the basics, Tom pulling threads from county archives and old business registries that revealed my parents' boutique wasn't just a failing venture, but a front for skirting regulations. With Mom's name on import manifests for goods from overseas suppliers that customs had flagged multiple times for quality issues bordering on counterfeit, handbags with logos too close to luxury brands, fabrics that unraveled under scrutiny, The kind of corner cutting that keeps small operations afloat in tough economic times but invites lawsuits from bigger fish. Dad's insurance side hustle fared no better. A string of lapsed policies and client complaints filed with the state board in the early 2000s, where he'd allegedly exaggerated coverage to close deals, leaving families shortchanged when claims hit. A pattern that echoed the neglect they'd shown me, always promising more than they could deliver and walking away when the bill came due. It painted them as survivors in a cutthroat world, the sort of everyday hustlers that fill diners across the Midwest swapping stories of near misses. But to me, it fueled a growing conflict, making me question if their greed was born of necessity or just a deep-seated flaw that had poisoned our bond from the start. The emotional confrontation blindsided me a week later, when Dad showed up at my office lobby uninvited, his rumpled suit and defeated posture a far cry from the confident salesman I'd known as a child, demanding a private word about settling this nonsense before it destroys us all. I relented, ushering him into a side room away from prying eyes, where he launched into a monologue laced with regret and resentment, claiming the lawsuit was Mom's idea, but that they both felt entitled after pouring everything into raising you, glossing over the boarding school exile and the years of minimal contact as if they were minor hiccups in an otherwise devoted parenting gig. His eyes welled up as he described their current struggles, the boutique shuttered by online competition, Dad's commissions drying up in a market favoring digital brokers, and for a heartbeat, I wavered. The old pull of familial duty tugging at me like a riptide, making me wonder if offering a quiet payout might end the madness without dredging up more pain for everyone involved. But then he slipped, referencing a gentleman's agreement with Grandpa for a stake in the hardware chain that I'd never heard of, and the hypocrisy hit like a splash of cold water, revealing how they'd rewritten history to suit their narrative. That's when the witty revenge took shape, born from that flash of clarity amid the hurt, as I steered the conversation toward the loan files I'd reviewed, casually mentioning how public records might interest a financial reporter if certain discrepancies came to light, all while slipping a prepped USB drive across the table under the guise of family photos that actually held redacted copies of the import violations and policy complaints. Dad, I said with a straight face that hid my inner chuckle at the absurdity, maybe it's time to own up to the boutique's shortcuts. Wouldn't want those old manifests surfacing in the wrong hands, turning this into more than a family spat. He paled, fumbling for excuses as his phone buzzed with an incoming tip I'd anonymously routed to his email via a burner account, exposing the hypocrisy in real time, and he left in a huff, the door clicking shut like the seal on their crumbling facade. It was a clever gut punch, satisfying in its precision. Without direct confrontation, yet it left me hollow, the audience of my conscience, those relatable folks juggling jobs and regrets, likely siding against my unyielding stance, seeing it as piling on rather than protecting what Grandpa built. The twist deepened that very night when Tom delivered his interim report in person, sliding a manila envelope across my kitchen table with hands that trembled slightly, revealing forged documents from a decade back where my parents had altered Grandpa's will drafts to insert themselves as beneficiaries, the signature's a clumsy match to his, but dated before his actual signing, complete with notary stamps from a discredited office in the suburbs. It was damning, proof of premeditated betrayal that could flip their suit into criminal charges, but it also unearthed a dilemma. Pursuing this meant exposing Grandpa's vulnerabilities in his later years, the trusting side he'd hidden behind his tough exterior, and as I pored over the pages by lamplight, the uncertainty swelled, hinting at even larger secrets tied to that anonymous caller. But before I could process it, my phone lit up with Sarah's urgent text. The Harpers had escalated, filing amended charges accusing me of tampering with estate records, a bold lie that thrust us into emergency hearings and left me staring at the ceiling, wondering how far they'd go to salvage their sinking ship. The amended charges accusing me of tampering with estate records hit like a sucker punch in the gut, arriving via overnight delivery just as Tom's forgery revelations were still sinking in. forcing me to huddle with Sarah in her office the next morning amid stacks of fresh filings that reeked of desperation and painted me as the villain in a plot twist even I hadn't anticipated. Their lawyer Withers spinning a tale of deleted emails and altered ledgers that ignored the ironclad backups Grandpa had mandated for every transaction in his empire. Sarah's face hardened as she circled the baseless claims on the documents, pointing out how this escalation screamed of a cornered animal lashing out, but it stirred a storm in me, amplifying the internal tug-of-war between slamming the door on my parents forever or cracking it open just enough to see if remorse lurked behind their greed, a dilemma that kept me up nights pacing my living room with views of the churning lake, wondering if revealing the full extent of their forgeries would heal the old wounds or just reopen them with surgical precision for the world to gawk at. Pre-trial tensions mounted like a gathering squall over the following weeks, with depositions scheduled and discovery demands flying back and forth, each exchange peeling back layers of our fractured history that made the air in meeting rooms thick with unspoken accusations, and I found myself grappling with a personal truth I'd buried deep, a letter Grandpa left unsealed in his desk, confessing that he'd once loaned my parents $100,000 not for the boutique, but to cover gambling debts Dad had racked up in underground poker games around the city, a secret he'd kept to spare me the shame, but one that now dangled like a loaded gun in my arsenal. Sharing it could demolish their credibility in a heartbeat, proving a pattern of deceit that went beyond civil squabbles into moral territory, yet holding it back felt like mercy I wasn't sure they deserved. Especially after their latest move had splashed my name across local news as the disinherited daughter's dirty tricks, twisting public sympathy toward the struggling parents in a way that had even my closest allies second-guessing my resolve. The audience watching this unfold, those everyday Americans balancing checkbooks and family feuds, might have rooted for a quicker olive branch, disagreeing with my stubborn refusal to negotiate a truce, seeing it as letting pride eclipse potential reconciliation, but the growing conflict only hardened my stance, the impending revenge simmering like a pot about to boil over. Tom's updates added fuel to the fire, uncovering ties between Withers and a shady network of suburban notaries who'd rubber-stamped my parents' forgeries, including the one on that Wisconsin cabin deed, where the lawyer had overlooked red flags for a cut of the proceeds, a web of complicity that made their whole case smell like week-old fish left out in the sun. It was the perfect opening for the satisfying revenge I'd been mulling, a subtle maneuver that would turn their own counsel against them without a whisper of my involvement, so I arranged a chance encounter with Withers at a networking luncheon for legal pros in the loop, posing as a potential client interested in estate planning for my expanding holdings, and over plates of rubbery chicken and small talk about market volatility. I dropped hints about irregularities in family trusts that mirrored his past cases, casually mentioning a tip line for bar ethics complaints that Tom had flagged as active. Withers' eyes darted as I described hypothetical scenarios of notary fraud leading to disbarment, his laughter forced and sweat beading under his collar, and by the end of the meal, he'd excused himself abruptly, only for Sarah to report later that afternoon that he'd advised the Harpers to pull back on the tampering accusations, citing insufficient evidence and risks of countersuits that could expose deeper liabilities. It was witty in its elegance, like feeding a fox its own tail, leaving them scrambling without me ever raising my voice, yet the victory tasted bittersweet, stirring doubts about whether I'd crossed into the same manipulative territory they'd occupied for years. As the court date circled closer, marked on my calendar with the finality of a deadline, the uncertainty peaked with another anonymous voicemail that crackled through on my landline, the voice now clearer but still veiled, warning that Victor's special file includes something about a sibling your folks never told you about. It could change the inheritance game entirely, a bombshell that froze me in place, heart-hammering as I replayed it, the implication of hidden family branches clashing with the revenge arc I'd set in motion and forcing me to confront if Grandpa's secrets were meant to protect or punish. Friends noticed my distraction during coffee catch-ups at corner bistros, urging me to consider therapy over litigation for the emotional wreckage, their concern a mirror to the audience's likely disapproval of my unyielding path. But the constantly building conflict drowned out the softer voices, propelling me toward the courthouse steps on the appointed morning, suit pressed and briefcase heavy with documents that held the power to rewrite everything. I walked into the courtroom that crisp October day, the scent of polished wood and stale coffee hanging in the air like anticipation itself. Spotting my parents at the plaintiff's table with Mom rolling her eyes in that familiar sneer of disbelief as if my presence was the real affront, Dad avoiding my gaze while whispering furiously to a fidgety Withers. The judge, Elena Vasquez, a stern figure with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for slicing through courtroom baloney like a hot knife, looked up from the docket with her routine scan, but her expression shifted mid-breath. Eyes widening behind her glasses as she double-checked the revised charges, her voice cutting through the hush like a thunderclap. "Wait, the charges are against you?" My parents' heads jerked up in unison, confusion twisting their features as the room held its collective breath, the frozen moment pregnant with the revelations I'd orchestrated, yet laced with that final layer of ambiguity about what other truths might spill out before the gavel fell. The judge's words sliced through the courtroom like a cold wind off Lake Michigan, freezing everyone in place as my parents' confusion morphed into outright alarm, Mom's hand flying to her mouth while Dad leaned forward, his whisper to Withers turning into a hissed demand for clarification that only amplified the stunned silence hanging over the room like a heavy curtain. Elena Vasquez adjusted her glasses with deliberate calm, her voice steady as she explained the pivot, noting how new evidence submitted by my counsel had prompted the state to intervene. Flipping the script from a simple inheritance dispute into formal charges against Richard and Linda Harper for fraud, embezzlement, and forgery spanning 2 decades, all tied to Grandpa Victor's assets in ways that made their lawsuit look like the desperate capstone to a lifetime of quiet larceny. The gallery murmured, a mix of reporters scribbling furiously and locals who'd wandered in for the drama exchanging glances that spoke volumes about the irony of a family feud turning criminal, and I stood there at the defense table, Sarah's hand steady on my arm, feeling the weight of orchestrated justice settle in while that anonymous voicemail about a possible sibling echoed unresolved in my mind, a loose thread threatening to snag the whole tapestry. Vasquez ordered the proceedings to continue with expedited testimonies, starting with Withers, who squirmed under oath, his earlier advice to drop claims now exposed as self-preservation after my luncheon nudge, admitting under cross-examination that he'd overlooked red flags in the Harper's filings for fear of deeper scrutiny on his own docket of questionable cases. Then came the evidence parade, Tom's handiwork shining through in projected documents that laid bare the forgeries on the Wisconsin cabin deed, the altered will drafts with signatures that forensics had matched to Dad's hand via old business records, and the siphoned funds from Grandpa's partnerships funneled through the boutique's accounts to cover everything from supplier payoffs to those hidden gambling debts I'd wrestled with revealing. Mom took the stand first, her composure cracking as she defended the loans as family understandings rather than theft, tearfully recounting hardships like the boutique's collapse under e-commerce giants and Dad's lost commissions in a shifting economy, painting themselves as victims of circumstance who'd only sued out of necessity after years of being sidelined by Victor's favoritism. It tugged at something in me, that plea for understanding from a woman who'd once dismissed my tears as dramatics, but Sarah's subtle shake of her head kept me grounded, reminding me how their narrative conveniently erased the neglect that had shaped my life into one of guarded independence. Dad followed, his testimony a rambling defense laced with resentment, claiming Grandpa's will was coerced by my constant presence in his final days, ignoring the medical logs showing I'd coordinated his care while they sent generic cards from afar. And as he detailed their contributions to my upbringing, the roof over my head before boarding school, the occasional visits that felt more like inspections, the hypocrisy burned, fueling a quiet humor at how they'd rewritten abandonment as investment, like calling a leaky faucet a feature in a fixer-upper. The audience in the pews shifted uncomfortably, some nodding along to their underdog story while others whispered about the mounting proof, and I sensed the disagreement brewing. Those relatable souls in their 40s and 50s likely questioning if I should have offered leniency earlier, seeing my pursuit of full accountability as overly punitive against parents who'd at least tried in their flawed way, a moral gray area that made the conflict royal even as vindication edged closer. When my turn came, I approached the stand with legs steady despite the knot in my chest that would cool under my palms as I recounted the truth in measured tones, starting with the microwave meals and empty school bleachers that defined my childhood. Not to vilify, but to contextualize how Grandpa's intervention had filled the voids they left, teaching me resilience through business lessons and late-night talks that built an empire worth fighting for. This inheritance isn't just money, I said, meeting their eyes across the room. It's the legacy of someone who chose me when you didn't, and defending it means exposing the deceptions that undermined him long before I inherited a dime. The words hung heavy, stirring a hush broken only by Mom's stifled sob, and Vasquez nodded thoughtfully, her gavel pausing as she weighed the human element against the hard facts, ultimately ruling to dismiss their civil claims with prejudice while greenlighting the criminal probe, a decision that left the Harper's ashen and me with the final piece of revenge I'd crafted. In the settlement huddle that followed, brokered in a side chamber thick with tension, I extended the offer through Sarah, a clean break where I'd cover their mounting legal tabs and provide $50,000 to relocate and rebuild, but only in exchange for signed confessions detailing every forgery, embezzlement, and unpaid debt, documents that would seal off future grabs at the estate and serve as a quiet deterrent to others tempted by family fortunes. They accepted after a hushed argument, their signatures trembling on the pages as Withers looked on defeated, the witty closure feeling like checkmate in a game they'd started but never mastered. Satisfying in its clever restraint yet laced with that light vulgarity of irony. What a load of baloney they'd spun, only to choke on it in the end. As the gavel fell for adjournment, sealing their fate with probation recommendations pending investigation, I walked out into the fading afternoon light, the courthouse steps echoing my heels like footsteps into an uncertain future. But the ambiguity lingered like fog rolling in from the lake, that sibling hint from the anonymous calls, traced later to a disgruntled ex-employee of Grandpa's who'd overheard Mom's whispers about a half-sibling given up young, never fully confirmed. A rumor that could upend the will if pursued, but one I chose to let fade, questioning if chasing it would heal or just fracture more lives. My parents slunk away to whatever diminished existence awaited, their remorse a murky question mark, genuine regret, or just survival instinct, and as I drove home through the city streets, the skyline blurring in my rearview, I pondered the cost of my victories. Had the revenge freed me from their shadows, or merely isolated me in a tower of my own making, leaving you to wonder what family ties are worth salvaging when trust lies in tatters?